Hey everybody. As you can imagine, I get lots of questions from people about their bikes to mechanical stuff because I've done lots of videos on doing mechanical things. And very often the questions you get are too wide for you to really be able to give a decent answer to. But sometimes you're asked a question and your mind goes down a rabbit hole and you're like, okay, this is a little bit worse. Well, not necessarily worse, but a little bit deeper than you're thinking. I had a comment today, and this is what sparked this video basically, because it reminded me of these being common things that people do to bikes. So I'm going to read that comment to you, and you'll see how, as I got answers back from him, it opened my eyes to, oh, I get what's going on here. I'm not going to mention any names, and to the person that posted this is no means to sort of like try and say you don't know what you're doing or anything like that. We all learn, but it became obvious from the way that you asked the questions that there was a little bit of misunderstanding going on, and I thought, well, I know lots of other people have these sorts of questions because this is quite a common occurrence, so maybe if I answer why these things happen, you'll understand what you need to do and why you can't do what you may have had in mind. So he says, "Hi Spicy, I have a Sinus Apache. I'm looking for some custom parts. Any ideas where's the best place?" That's a very wide question, so I just said, what sort of parts are you after? You'll need to be a little bit more specific. And he said, "Hi mate, so like a decent rear sprocket, as the last one broke and all the bolts snapped. Also the throttle where the kill switch button is, it keeps moving. What's the best way to prevent this?" So there's a few questions there and a few things that like flash some alert signals for me, so I thought, let's cover them and it might help some other people as well. And if, by the way, if any of you are experienced and there's anything I've missed or you want to add in, go for it. I really do want this to be a discussion of learning because the more people that get this sort of information, the less of this happens. I'll get onto the throttle in a minute because that's a common one. But first, let's talk about sprockets. So on a motorcycle, obviously you have a front and a rear sprocket with a chain, and that's what transfers the drive from the engine to the rear wheel. There's a few things that you have to make sure you do with this. You have to make sure you clean it. Use some sort of chain degreaser and a brush. Don't do it while the bike's running. Scrub it out best you can, clean it up, and then make sure that you lube it properly. Choice of lube and stuff and choice of cleaners, it varies. There's lots of people go old school, just very simple things. Other people like to go for more sort of, high-tech cans and sprays and stuff. Do what you want to do. Most of it's going to be fine. Caveat, if it is a product which says it's intended to do that job. This is not saying spray your chain with WD-40. Obviously over time, the chain and sprockets wear down and the gaps in the sprocket become bigger and the chain will wear as well, and that will give you extra length in it because everything's got a little bit of extra wear, a little bit of extra length, and everything becomes all slack. You can tighten this up by moving the entire axle backwards, which is something you have to regularly do on a motorcycle. And if you don't do that and make sure it's at the right tension, you're going to have problems. If it's really loose, it can jump off. And if it's a bit loose, it's going to keep whacking into the sprocket because each time that you go to pull away, it needs to take up that tension. And then when it goes solid like a bar, because that's kind of what a chain's supposed to be, is like a flexible solid bar, it goes bang, and it puts a lot of force into the rear sprocket. So his question of where can I get custom parts, I think what he means is where can I get third-party sprockets, because the stock ones you get on Chinese bikes, by the way, this is a Suzuki DRZ 400 SM, but it's all the same. The standard sprockets that come on Chinese bikes, they're not the best. They do. By the way, I used Chinese bikes for like 7 years. I'm very well known for working with Chinese bikes, so I know about these bikes. They're not the best, but they are quite cheap, but they do kind of wear out a little bit faster. So my suggestion would be, if you want to go for a good, solid, cheap sprocket, which is third party, go for one by a company like JT. But when it comes to replacing a sprocket, you should never replace just one sprocket or get a new chain and put that on old sprockets, because all of it, when it's very first made, is designed to fit together properly and mesh properly and everything's supposed to work. It's all correct. And then as it wears, it all wears evenly. And by moving the swing arm, the axle back on the swing arm, you take up that slack and everything works perfectly fine. If you were to, for instance, just change your rear sprocket, what you're going to have is a chain which has become molded to another sprocket, and it's going to wear the new rear sprocket much faster and unevenly, most likely. To be fair, you won't be able to actually do that for too long because your chain's going to become so so worn that the extra length is going to mean that you don't have enough adjustment in your swing arm to be able to get it far enough back to take that slack out. That's when sometimes people go, oh, well, you know what I can do is I can move it forwards and cut a link out, and then, two links, you have to take two out to get back to the right connectors. I can just do that. You're now putting that chain in a position where it's really old, really, really worn. It's definitely not matching up with this rear sprocket, if it's the new one. And the chances of that chain snapping on you are really high. Now, snap chains can go several ways. It can pop off and spit off the bike and everything's fine, you just have to apply the brakes, you lose all engine braking. No damage to the bike, everything's great, just buy new chain sprockets and slap it on and you're okay. The other option is that it can do things like it can wrap up around the rear wheel and it can lock the rear wheel. I've actually had that happen at about 20 miles an hour on my original Pulse Adrenaline 125. Another option with the chain coming off is it can swing and hit you in the foot and do you some really nasty damage. There's some nasty pictures of people being whipped by chains when they come off bikes. It can do a lot of damage or it could not. But chances are it's not going to be good. In fact, one of the worst case scenarios is when it snaps somewhere like here and you're going quick. As the chain goes along and swings around the front sprocket, it whips and it can smash, and I mean smash, the engine casing, and you'll just have oil pour out under the bike. Huge amounts of damage, could be a write-off depending on what bike it is. So yeah, you don't want to do that. Of course, the next thing is if you've replaced your rear sprocket and the chain's, it's okay, it's fine. You haven't been checking your front sprocket and it's probably got nothing left on it. It's going to start stripping teeth. It's going to start jumping. Okay, it's not going to do any major damage to your bike if it jumps a couple of teeth. But you definitely don't want it doing that. So sprockets are quite simple. There's just a few rules that you stick to, which is replace the chain and sprockets at the same time, make sure you keep them clean, make sure you keep it well adjusted, make sure you keep it well lubed, and use it until you run, well, not until you completely run out of adjustment. On some bikes, it makes the wheelbase so long, it makes the bike not handle very well. But you're okay to go to the end pretty much and just make sure you replace it. And don't be in that situation where you're fully extended and you're waiting to get the parts and your chain's getting slacker and slacker and slacker, and just don't. Well, you're never going to unsee this. Have you noticed how these are all smiley faces? I saw it a while ago and I cannot unsee it. I love it. The next thing to address is the fact he mentioned that the bolts were snapping, and that's really set off some warning signs in my head, especially when compounded with the throttle issue. Let's go to the bench and talk about that a little bit more. Okay, I've got this room to explain the things I want to explain to you. If your sprocket looks like this, then no, it probably needs replacing, because this is actually the wheel that was on my first bike, Betty, my Pulse Adrenaline 125, when I had a pretty serious crash about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. Yeah, it was that long ago. People who know what bike this is. And this has been sat outside ever since. So that's what years and years of just being sat outside looks like. I have to say though, this rim has gone this lovely gold bronze. It's amazing. I love it. It's so uniform as well. Anyway, sidetracking. Okay, so the thing I want to talk about is these snapping bolts or studs. Now, depending on what sort of bike you have, you will either have bolts that go through and bolt into the hub, or you'll have studs, which are pieces of thread that come out the hub and you put a nut on them. Either works fine. These need to be put on at the right tension, and that's why you use a torque wrench. Now, with experience of using bikes over the years and doing all the work on them myself, you get what I would call a mechanical sympathy, which is knowing how tight to do something by hand. And I can do up a sprocket by hand and know that it's not too tight and know that it's not going to come undone. But the best way to make sure you don't make a mistake is to use a torque wrench. They're not too expensive. You just dial in the torque that you need to and then do it up, and when it gets to the right point it clicks, so you don't over tighten things and you don't under tighten things. Because under-tightening or over-tightening is exactly why those bolts snapped. I can demonstrate to you how that works. First thing I need to do is loosen these bolts off. If you notice, these have got things called tab washers, which are flat pieces of soft metal that once you've torqued this up, you bend them up and hammer them around the bolt, and it means that it can't undo itself under vibrations or something like that. A lot of people, because these will snap when you try to take them off, because you're supposed to change them every single time you change a sprocket. Every time they come out, you're supposed to put new ones in. Yeah, sure, you can use them a few times, but you will get them snap off eventually. If you're more careful when you take them off and put them on, you'll do better. Okay, what I'm going to say now does not mean everyone that has a 125, but on average, people who have 125s, it's the first bike they've ever had. They don't really know anything about motorcycle mechanics necessarily. They'll try and do stuff themselves, which is absolutely great, but unfortunately they sometimes make big mistakes, and it's worth learning a few basics about mechanics and bike mechanics before you try and do this stuff yourself when it comes to critical things. This is pretty critical. So as I was saying, a lot of new riders don't know what they're doing, and when people buy bikes secondhand, they don't know either. And then they have problems, and then they come to people like me that have some experience, and this is where we hear that thing, and we're like, oh, this is a rabbit hole. yes, some 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds have been doing mechanics since they were young, they might have had someone teach them, and they're absolutely perfectly proficient at looking after their bike and doing all these jobs. I'm not saying all of you, but you are definitely not majority, you're a minority amongst your brethren and sisterin. Right, so let me just... Okay, so I just flatten the tabs down. You just tap them over and flatten them out of the way. You need to make sure they're right over because you need to get the socket over the top of it. You can even, if you want, put the socket over it and give it a very light tap just to make sure that that little inside edge is right down and out of the way. So you don't want to get the socket half on or a slight angle because you'll just round it as it jumps off. I have just noticed though that these are A2 stainless steel bolts, which means that I at some point replaced them and went, well, I'm not going to use the stock ones, I'm going to get better parts, which is exactly what I was saying about you don't have to use the stock sprockets on Chinese bikes. And people criticise them saying, oh, they have terrible sprockets and chains. It's like, change them then. You know, it's not a part that stays on the bike forever. It's going to be on there a year, maybe 2. So next time you want to change them, go for something that's not as cheap. Personally, most of the time I did use the Chinese stuff and just accepted it didn't last as long and looked after it a bit better. But here's the question, is this going to undo? Oh, it did. See? Properly torqued bolts are easy to get out. Overly torqued bolts are not. It should just be a matter of loosening them off like that. Even though this has been outside for years and years and years, life's too short for this. Right, so as you can see, there is nothing keying this sprocket onto this surface. This is free to move. So the only thing that is keeping that sprocket in place are these bolts. Now I know people get offended easily, calm down, but this is a characterised play of 17-year-old bike owner's mate who thinks he knows about bikes. Oh yeah mate, you just change the rear sprocket, you don't need to change the chain or anything like that, it's way too expensive. What? You heard you're supposed to change both? No, you don't need to do that. People don't know what they're talking about. I'm 17. I've been doing this for an entire year. Right, these things. No, you don't need those. Right, let's stick these bolts in. We got all of them. Yeah, it's all right. We've got 6. If we had 5, it'd be fine. Just stick these in. Oh, that one's a bit cross-threaded. It's all right. We'll just give that an extra tighten and it'll sort itself out. Right, so then we just got to tighten these up. And this is where it can go in 2 directions. You either have the guy who just goes full on them with a 3-foot bar and does them up as tight as he possibly can, and as Ave says, until it cracks and then back off half a turn. That is one of the ways that you can end up damaging these bolts. The other option is you don't do them up enough, and if they put on just enough torque to make it feel like, yeah, that's solid, that's not going anywhere, even if they use the tab washers, even if they buy brand new ones, if it's not properly torqued, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that, but when you have the force of an engine trying to twist it, what ends up happening is this. I'm trying to hold the wheel still so you can see this. Right, see that? So the 2 ways, maybe there's 3 ways that studs or bolts snap, is number 1, which is Strength Man, who basically does them up until they're so tight that they actually crack the thread of the bolt, because this part of the bolt is being threaded into the hub. This part here, through the sprocket, there's no threads there, so it's not being supported there. So as you tighten this in, what you're doing is putting pressure on the heads of the bolts, you know, pulling the bolt down more and more until you're putting strain in the middle of the bolt. So what you can end up doing is introducing weaknesses or even a crack there. I mean, you can shear a bolt that way. It's basically if you get to the point it's starting to yield, it's starting to shear, and then you stop, it's a really weak connection. It might feel okay, as I say, but you give it a good few whacks backwards and forwards, and they're going to start ping, ping off. And these can go in several ways, like maybe one pops out one day, then more strains put on the remaining ones, and then the next day another one pops off, and that magnifies the amount of force on the other ones, and maybe it's uneven, and it's just more likely to suddenly and go. Or they can go all at once. You know, you'll have one go, and it'll instantly just go around the whole lot, and it goes. If it's the slower version, you had the opportunity to notice there was a bolt missing, which is why you're supposed to check your bike over. If you see one missing, don't ride with it, because it's a good indication there's a problem with the other ones if it's sheared. If it's just fallen out, well then make sure the other ones are tight. But if it's actually sheared off, then you're probably going to have problems with the others. And you've just removed one of the little strengths it had, you're going to have problems, obviously. The under-tightening problem, say you had the tab washers in place, and they haven't really moved much, but the sprocket is able to keep doing this hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times, and it's a lot of force of it going bang, bang, bang as you're on and off the throttle. On the back brake, off the back brake, you know, it's going to keep doing this. Over time, it's going to change the structure of the metal, it's going to become brittle, and it's just going to go, and it's going to break them. And then you're in the same scenario as before, where maybe one will go, maybe all of them will go. But if you're getting snapped bolts, it's because someone has done them up too tight or not done them up enough, which is an absolutely classic rookie mistake that is something you'll find in, you know, bikes owned by people or cars who don't really know what they're doing. In time, as I say, you will get a mechanical sympathy and understanding of how tight you can do things, and a lot of these jobs, then you'll just do it by hand and you'll be happy that it's okay and you won't have any problems. But there are critical ones, and changing the chain and sprockets, although very easy for people to do, it's very easy to not do it correctly, because the torque settings that matter in this case are doing some big jobs like holding the wheel on. Because obviously changing your chain and sprockets, you're going to need to know the torque settings and get it correct for the axle. You're going to need to make sure that it's correct for these bolts, and you're going to need to make sure it's correct for the countershaft nut, as in the nut that holds on your front sprocket. As I'm doing a bit on chain and sprockets, I really should include this little bit. So the U's that you get when it's new, you get nice thick teeth, and the U's are nice and uniform. Over time, they're going to widen out as these teeth become thinner. As these turn into little blades, that means they're way past it. You want to replace them when they're slightly wider U's. When they're those thin blades, they start snapping off, you can lose teeth, and it can start jumping on the sprocket. And I have seen... This is why I'm not being particularly harsh, I don't think, on 17-year-olds. Or maybe I should be saying new riders in general, or people with no mechanical knowledge, but still have the confidence of youth to be like, it'll be fine. I won't check with someone who knows. That's the difference. As people get older, they tend to do that step. But yeah, the reason I'm saying about like 17-year-olds new riders is because you don't see this on bigger bikes. You see this sort of stuff, this basic mechanical lack of understanding or lack of maintenance on 125s. I don't know whether it's because people just don't realise they need to do this work. I mean, I very often get comments that people seem mad about having to replace the chain and sprockets as if it was something that went wrong with the bike, like a broken part. And it's like, no, it's like the tyres and the brake pads. These things have to be changed. Oh, it only lasted 2 years. Yeah, that's about pretty good for a chain and sprocket set. And if you want to check my theory on this, go to a local bike cafe, local bike spot, look at the big bikes, look at the chains, see if they're all like relatively clean, relatively well adjusted, etc, etc. Sprocket's not too bad. Then go to a college, if you can, and go and look at the bike stall there. You will see nightmares and horrors. Okay, so why am I making such a big point of this? It's because it was compounded with what they said about the throttle. You see, this is a rookie mistake by someone who's doing work on a bike and doesn't know what they're doing. And that is why those things happen, as we've explained. With the throttle, it's very simple, that the housing of the throttle... Maybe I'll show you. Okay, please excuse my shakiness, I've gone freehand here. So the throttle housing, which is the bit that the throttle connects into, this needs to be solid on the bars, obviously, because this is turning against it. This has got spring pressure on it from the carb or the EFI system, and it wants to turn it the other way. So what it might do, if this isn't securely locked in place, is that when you turn the throttle, the whole housing turns and you don't actually get a throttle turn, you just get the whole thing turning around. Then it can be in the wrong place when it goes the other way. The way these are held in place most of the time is in this housing there will be a pin, and that pin will go into a hole which is drilled into the bar. So, bars like that, the pin goes in, it locates it in the right place, and that stops everything turning. But when people come to replace their bars, and I'm not going to lie, when I first did this I also didn't drill the hole. As I say, when you get the new bars, unless they're specifically designed for your bike, they won't have any hole drilled in them. And you have to get that housing in the right place and drill that hole into the bars so the pin locates into it. Again, inexperience, 17-year-old, hang on a minute, you can just pull this pin out. There you go, clamp it on, it'll be fine. I did the same thing, but what I actually did was I put a Jubilee clip inside the housing because it just so happened to be big enough and safely away from all the work into the throttle that it did work. I do not advise you do that. I actually think that's a really bad idea because that advice It works in a very few examples where you have the knowledge to say, oh yeah, this will be okay, or no, it won't. But if people just do it, they could end up locking their throttle on. You don't want to wrap up electrical tape around it, or foil or anything like that. Ideally, yes, in some cases this can actually work, but that's not best practice, and I have to teach best practice because I don't... This is the thing, if you want to do this to your own bike, it's absolutely fine. Just don't advise someone else to do it. And now you can see why so many alarm signals with this bike went off, because that is a clear indication that someone has changed the handlebars without knowing what they're doing and just shoved something in, and it's not working, their solution, because everything's moving. Then you compound it with the snapped studs on the rear sprocket, and you're like, okay, so this person hasn't done that up correctly, and they haven't done this job correctly. The advice I gave the commenter, the original, the OP, as it were, was... I explained what these things were and said, actually, I'm probably going to make a video, but I'm not going to mention any names, and hopefully you'll get some information from that will be useful for you. But also to get the rest of the bike checked over by someone who knows what they're talking about. And again, this is not your mate who thinks he knows what he's talking about. There's a thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that the more stupid someone is, the more confident they are. And there are a lot of people out there who are, younger or very inexperienced, but extremely confident. And if they want to do it to their bike, and they'll live with the repercussions, that's fine. But not when it's someone else's. If I work on someone else's bike, for instance, like I say, I've been working on bikes for 12 years. If I work on their bike, I double, triple, quadruple check every nut, every bolt. I do everything by best practice. I don't make any chances with it, and then I go and ride the bike to make sure that it's fine. And I keep an eye on it, and I'll check things a day later. I mean, sometimes when I've worked on my other half's bike, she's about to go, and I'm like, I just want to double check a couple of things, just to absolutely be sure. And I run through this little checklist. There is nothing wrong with doing it 5 times and being right every single time. Because the time that you don't do that and something goes wrong, well, then it kind of feels like it's on you. It's a responsibility to work on someone's bike that people take far too lightly. Here you go, you can have a look at the beefy beast. He is filthy. I'm actually about to start doing probably a series of videos working on some stuff on this bike, working on my maintenance stuff, bits of rust. That's probably the first thing I want to go over the frame, get rid of bits of rust and repaint over them. Basically stuff to make sure that longevity-wise this bike's going to be in good condition for a while. And this is the sort of stuff that you have to do that some people don't. And it's why bikes become, I'm not going to say death traps, but dangerous. No, I'm going to say it, death traps. Hopefully through this discussion I may have imparted some knowledge. If anyone wants to add anything, please do. I'm very interested in what people want to add on top of what I've had to say. If you've got any corrections, go for it. I'm always willing to learn and be corrected. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit that like button. If you really want to help this channel, subscribe and maybe even consider joining my Patreon for just $1 a month. You get to see videos 3 days early, you get to PM me, and also you get to be part of the monthly Q&As. There you go. Leave a like, do the right thing, hit the bell. Catch you next time. If you enjoyed this video and the other content on the channel, please consider following the links in the description to show your support.